This is a video about writing compare-contrast essays, and this is going to focus on point-by-point format. That's the requirement for this essay. And first I want to start by talking about why you're comparing and contrasting in the first place. So in this class or in any other class that you take, you might be asked to compare and contrast two things, like a human skeleton and a snake skeleton, an apple and a clementine, or maybe different measures or different candidates on the ballot. Do I already regret holding up these props for the video? Yes, but I'm plowing ahead. So I want to focus on point-by-point format rather than block format, because block format tends to give you an essay that's not very complex. So before I explain point by point, let me explain block format so you know why you should not use block format in college level essays. With block format, you take the two things you're comparing and contrasting, let's say apples and clementines, you write an introduction paragraph, one big paragraph about apples, one big paragraph about clementines, followed by a conclusion. You can probably already see that there are limitations to this structure. First, you're not really doing the complex work of comparing and contrasting the two fruit, right? Instead, you just have two paragraphs, one about each fruit, right? So you're not really comparing and contrasting. Also, with block format, you're limited to a 4-paragraph essay, an intro, 2 body paragraphs, and a conclusion. And people who write block format essays, they tend to oversimplify, and instead of really comparing and contrasting things side by side or trait by trait and going into details, these essays tend to gloss over differences and similarities. So we really want to move beyond block format. So don't use block format for this essay, and I don't recommend it for any other essays that you're going to write. We want to use point-by-point format. That means that we're still comparing and contrasting two things or two ideas or two characters, but you're dividing your essay according to point, not according to each character or each fruit, but according to a point about both characters or both fruit. Let me show you what this looks like by using an example of James Bond versus Austin Powers. Now, again, you're not writing your essay about either of these characters. I'm just showing you this as a hypothetical example, right? You're going to be writing your essay about two of the characters in the short story that you've selected for this assignment. But let's say hypothetically, just so you can see the structure, you were comparing and contrasting James Bond and Austin Powers. Before you even begin structuring your essay, you might want to come up with a couple of points of comparison or contrast, or a little bit of both, about both men. So we might notice that they're both spies, right? But they have very different spy skills. You might notice that they're both English, but one speaks in kind of like the Queen's English and is very polished and slick and smooth. The other uses a lot of 1970s slang. You might notice that their personal style is very different, right? James Bond is wearing well-tailored suits. He's pretty sophisticated with his personal style, and Austin Powers has his chest hair poking out. He's wearing bell bottoms and ricky-ticky flowers. He's kind of a spoof, right? He's a parody of a James Bond type of figure. So if I were writing my essay about these two characters, I would come up with a few points that I want to compare and contrast. And compare-contrast essays that use point-by-point format, they can be more comparison, focusing on similarities. They can be more contrast, focusing on differences, or more likely they'll be doing a little bit of both at the same time. That's what makes point-by-point format a better format, is it's also flexible. So you're going to begin your essay with a hook, right? We've talked about hooks before: a description, an anecdote, a quote from a scholar, a startling fact, the significance of the work, ask a compelling rhetorical question, a subjective question, reference a common interpretation. So just some general hook strategies. Of course, some sort of transition between the hook and the thesis, where you reference the writer, or in this case, I guess it would be the filmmaker, and the titles of the works. And then your thesis should mention both characters, both things that you're comparing and contrasting. Also, the points you will be comparing and contrasting. In this case, it would be style, language, and spy skills, but of course I could use different words. But also you want to go beyond just listing to include the reason for comparison and contrasting. In other words, what does comparing and contrasting these two characters, what does that reveal? So point 1 is style. I would have a topic sentence that mentions style for both characters. So I'd have an integrated quotation that gives me one example for Austin Powers, so an integrated quote from the movie, then lots of analysis, then I'd have an integrated quote for Bond, followed by lots of analysis and some sort of wrap-up sentence. That way, in this first paragraph, I'm talking about both characters, but I'm only focusing on one very specific point, right? Their style, what kind of suits they wear, what shoes they wear, things like that. So I'm focusing just on that one specific subtopic, but I'm talking about both characters, and I have a quote, I have support for both characters. Maybe my second point's language, right? Yes, they both speak English, but in very different ways. So I'd have a topic sentence that mentions point 2 and both characters. A quote for Powers and analysis, a quote for Bond and analysis of both characters. It's really important that you follow the same order that you established earlier in the essay. So if in the first body paragraph or the second paragraph overall, I start with Powers and then I do Bond, I want to do that for the second paragraph and the third paragraph and however many paragraphs I have. Same thing, spy skills, right? Maybe I want to talk about how even though they're both spies, they're very different, right? One is really sophisticated with his weaponry or with his ability to read other people, the other not so much. So I'd have one quote for Powers, one for Bond, using that same order throughout the entire essay. Another good part about using point-by-point format is that you can have as many paragraphs as you want, right? So I could add more points, but I'm just showing you 3 just as an example. Of course, you can have more than 3 points. And then a conclusion will do the same thing a conclusion does in any essay. It echoes the thesis. Don't cut and paste it. Don't regurgitate it, but echo the thesis. Remind the reader in different words of what your main idea was. And then don't just summarize with everything you've just said. You're beyond that at this point. End with memorable closing words. Connect your topic to a social, political, intellectual, cultural, or economic issue or spice. Explain the significance of comparing and contrasting them. Connect it to a theme. Explain which side the text favors. Extend your argument. Make it bigger in some way. Those are things that we've already talked about. So if you're fuzzy on hook strategies and concluding word strategies, you can go back to earlier in the module to get more strategies for beginning and ending your essay really effectively.